The night was cold, though no one would have guessed it from the dry heat that clung to the town's air all day long, and Elinor felt the bite of it as the chains rattled against her wrists. While she was marched through the street, the townsfolk leaned out of windows and doorways to watch her pass, some with narrowed eyes, others with cruel grins. A few even spat into the dirt near her boots, not because they knew her story, but because they liked the sight of someone already claimed by the noose. She kept her head low, her hair tangled across her face, her body thin from too many days with too little food. The deputy muttered at her to move faster and shoved her shoulder when she stumbled. The sound of laughter drifted down from the saloon balcony, where two men clutched their whiskey glasses and called her thief, liar, witch, words that had followed her longer than she could remember. She did not answer. She only walked on until they reached the squat stone building with iron bars that served as a jail. And there, the sheriff himself waited by the door, hat pulled low, chewing on a toothpick with the calm of a man who thought his law was the same as God's word. They dragged her inside, the cell already smelling of sweat and rust, and when the door clanged shut behind her, she sat on the wooden bench and let the weight of the iron settle on her wrists. The deputy tossed the key to the sheriff, who pocketed it like treasure, and then the two of them stepped outside, leaving her in silence. She could still hear the buzz of voices from the street, the way stories of her crime twisted larger with each telling. She had taken bread and medicine, nothing more, but already she heard whispers of a knife, of blood spilled in the dust, of a storekeeper found dead though she had never raised a hand against anyone. Lies moved faster than truth, and by sunrise those lies would tighten the rope around her neck. She pressed her back against the cold wall and stared at the dirt floor, her stomach hollow, her body too tired to tremble. She thought of her mother long gone, of a father who had once promised to protect her, then vanished into the hills, of nights she had gone hungry and told herself she could endure it. But this was different. There was no enduring the gallows. There was only waiting. Her throat burned, but no tears came. The well of shame had dried them up long before tonight. She thought of the child she had fed with the stolen loaf, the boy coughing in a narrow alley, his ribs showing like hers. She had slipped him half the bread before the deputy's hand clamped down on her arm. And now the boy lived while she waited for the noose. Perhaps that was worth something, perhaps not. She could not tell any more. She heard the creak of the hanging tree outside as the night wind pressed through its branches, and she closed her eyes, knowing that by dawn the rope would swing and no one would remember her name. The morning sun bled slow over the horizon, staining the sky a pale red as the sheriff hammered the notice of hanging onto the rough wood post outside the jail. Each strike of his hammer echoed through the street and drew a crowd of curious faces, men in worn hats, women clutching baskets, even children peeking from behind skirts. They all pressed forward to read the words they already knew. Elinor James to hang at sunrise for theft. And though the crime was small, the punishment was fixed. Rope was cheaper than mercy in towns like this. The sheriff stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. Though the day was still cool, his jaw set, as if daring anyone to argue. None did. They only whispered among themselves and nodded like sheep, agreeing with the shepherd. It was then the stranger rode in, horse dark with dust from a long trail, coat plain and patched at the seams, hat pulled low enough to shadow his eyes. He moved with a slowness that carried weight, the kind of stillness that unsettled men who liked to fill silence with noise. He guided his horse down the main street, his boots hitting the ground with the quiet thud of someone used to walking alone. He tied the reins to the hitching post outside the saloon and looked once at the crowd gathered around the notice, not speaking, just watching, with the patience of a man measuring distance before taking aim. When the sheriff's hammer fell for the last time, the stranger stepped closer, his shadow long across the dust, and his voice low but steady asked only one question: when is the rope to be knotted? The words hung in the air sharp as a knife, and for a moment the crowd fell silent. Then the sheriff squinted at him, suspicious, but answered, "Sunrise tomorrow, as the law says." The stranger gave no opinion, No nod of agreement or protest. He simply shifted his weight and walked toward the saloon, his spurs brushing lightly against the boards. The townsfolk eyed him like they weren't sure if he was lawman or outlaw. His face gave nothing away. Inside the saloon, the piano stopped mid-tune as he stepped through the bat-wing doors. He set a silver coin on the bar without asking the price. The barkeep raised his brows, but slid him a glass of whiskey anyway. Silver was more than most ever laid down for a drink. The stranger sipped slow, not flinching at the stares from the men at the card table, not answering the whispers about where he came from. His silence worked like a wall they could not climb. When he finished, he placed the empty glass back neat on the counter and walked out without a word. Back in the street, his eyes lingered on the notice nailed to the post, his face still unreadable, though something flickered behind his gaze. Not pity, not anger, but something weighty, as if the words had stirred an old memory he did not wish to show. The crowd watched him, waiting for some sign, but he only pulled his hat lower and moved toward his horse, the sound of the gallows creaking in the wind following him, as if reminding them all of what dawn would bring. The night settled heavy over the town, the saloon spilling noise into the street, while the jail sat quiet, except for the creak of its wooden frame. Elinor lay on the hard bench with her hands bound, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, where shadows from the lantern swayed like nooses above her. Outside the window came the jeers of men drunk on cheap whiskey, their voices slurred yet sharp as knives. They called her thief, liar, witch, cursed blood, cursed luck, words that carried more weight than the iron around her wrists. She did not answer. She had long since learned silence was easier than trying to convince the world she deserved to breathe. Her chest rose and fell slow, as if she was already preparing herself for the rope that waited with the dawn. The sheriff sat at his desk a few feet from her cell, boots on the table, hat tipped low, his toothpick shifting between his teeth while he hummed to himself. He did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him, both of them waiting in their own ways for the sun to rise. The hours dragged until the sound of spurs clicked against the boardwalk outside, steady and measured, not the stagger of a drunk or the stomp of a deputy. The sheriff straightened, his hand brushing the butt of his pistol out of habit. The door opened, and the stranger stepped into the glow of the lantern, his coat plain, his face shadowed beneath his hat. He stood in the doorway, a long moment, before moving closer. The sheriff narrowed his eyes and asked what business he had at this hour. The stranger did not answer right away. Instead, he pulled from his coat a worn leather pouch and set it heavy on the desk. The coins inside clinked sharp against the wood. The sheriff gave a short, bitter laugh and picked it up. Weighing it in his palm, he spilled some silver into the light, the glow catching in his greedy eyes. Elinor lifted her head just enough to see, her heart thudding, though she could not yet name why. The sheriff said in a low drawl that silver did not change the law, but still he counted each piece with care, his fingers moving quick and sure. The stranger watched without shifting, his silence thick enough to fill the room. When the last coin rang against the pile, the sheriff leaned back and let out a grunt, muttering that lawmen were never paid half so honest, then slid the pouch into his pocket. Elinor's breath caught. She raised her eyes fully for the first time, the weight of her shame pressing against the sudden spark inside her chest. The stranger was watching her, not through her as so many had done, not past her as if she were nothing but dust on the floor, but at her, his gaze steady and unreadable. Her throat tightened, as if words wanted to come yet would not. She turned her face away, but the memory of his eyes stayed fixed, more unsettling than any insult thrown from the street. For in that look was no jeer, no judgment, only the kind of notice she had never known. And it frightened her more than the gallows waiting in the dawn. The sheriff leaned back in his chair with the coins stacked neat on the desk, his thumb rubbing one over and over, as though testing if silver could lie. His eyes flicked from the stranger to the cell, then back again. At last he gave a short laugh that held no humor, and pulled the keys from his belt. He tossed them into the air, where they spun in the lamplight, before landing with a clatter. "The law doesn't argue with silver," he said, and the sound of iron unlocking rang sharp in the silence. Elinor pushed herself to her feet slowly, her legs stiff from hours pressed against the bench, her wrists raw where the shackles had rubbed. She stepped forward, uncertain if she was walking into another trap. The sheriff opened the door and gestured her out, muttering that a rope could stretch for anyone, woman or man, guilty or not, but a full purse was law enough for him. She passed him without a word, her eyes fixed on the floor, and the stranger waited near the door still as stone. Outside, the night air struck her face cold and dry. The street was quiet, except for a few figures lingering in the shadows. They had heard the exchange of silver, and now they whispered like coyotes, bought like cattle. Some spat into the dust. Others muttered that the stranger must be kin to her. No one else would throw coin at a thief's neck. Elinor felt their stares like stones against her skin, shame pressing harder than the chains ever had. She stopped in the middle of the street, not knowing whether to run or kneel. Her body shook, though not from fear of the gallows anymore, but from the weight of freedom she did not trust. She lifted her wrists and saw the deep red marks left by iron, lines like rope already burned into her flesh. And for a moment she almost wished the cell door had stayed shut. It was easier to face death than to stand in the open with no place to go. The stranger stepped forward without hurry, his boots scuffing against the boards. He did not reach for her, did not speak, only held out a wool blanket, rough and plain. She stared at it before taking it, pulling it close around her shoulders, warmth spreading slow through her thin frame. He gave a single nod, then turned toward his horse, his hand brushing the reins, a gesture as simple as a command, yet not cruel. She looked at him, his face still shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, his silence more steady than any words could be. She swallowed hard and stepped after him, unsure if she followed by choice or because she no longer had the strength to stand alone. The horse shifted, breath misting in the night air. The stranger mounted in one smooth motion, then looked down at her, his gaze steady but unreadable. She clutched the blanket tight, the rope burns still stinging on her wrists, and climbed into the saddle behind him. The town lights faded as they rode out, voices still spitting their judgment into the dark, yet none dared follow. By midnight she was free, though freedom tasted strange, not sweet but sharp, like a wound that had not learned how to heal. The trail stretched long and empty beneath the pale light of the moon, the sound of hooves muffled in the dust. Elinor clung to the blanket, wrapped tight around her thin shoulders, as the stranger's horse carried them both beyond the town's edge. Silence wrapped them heavier than the night air. She kept waiting for him to speak, waiting for the price of her freedom to be named. A demand, a sneer, a command to pay him back with her body or her labor, but none came. He only rode steady, his back straight, his hands easy on the reins, his face hidden by the brim of his hat, never once glancing back to see if she was still behind him, as if he trusted she would follow even when she did not trust herself. At dawn they stopped by a creek to water the horse. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots crunching against the stones. Elinor slid down awkwardly, her legs weak from the long ride. She stumbled as her feet hit the ground and the world tilted. His hand shot out, catching her by the arm, firm yet careful, holding her upright until her balance returned. Then just as quickly he let go, turning away as if the touch meant nothing. Her skin burned where his fingers had steadied her, not with fear, but with something she could not name. She whispered a thank you, but he gave no reply, only knelt to fill the horse's nosebag with oats from a pouch. They rode on through the morning, the land opening wide with low hills and brush. The silence grew heavier with every mile. She bit her lip until it bled, trying to summon courage to speak. Yet each time the words died, she wanted to ask who he was, why he had paid, what he wanted from her now. But she could not push sound through her throat, the memory of chains still pressing her like a second skin. The thought that freedom was only another kind of bargain, making her chest ache. By noon, The sun was high and relentless, and she felt her body sway in the saddle, but he never slowed, his horse carrying them as if it knew the way without needing to be told. When the sun sank low, they stopped in a hollow where scrub trees broke the wind. He unsaddled the horse and set a small fire. She watched him move with quiet precision, each action practiced, as though the work of years. When the flames caught, he reached into his pack and pulled free a heel of bread. Breaking it in half, he handed the larger piece to her without a word. She stared at it, at his hand, at his face still hidden by shadow. Hunger clawed at her stomach, but suspicion gnawed harder. Still, she took it, holding it close, as if it might vanish. She nibbled, the dry crust rough against her tongue, and the taste of it nearly made her weep. Food, given, not taken, not fought for, not stolen. The fire crackled, the smoke curling upward, and at last she dared whisper one word. Why? Her voice thin and trembling in the dark. He did not look at her. He only stirred the flames with a stick, his silence carrying more weight than any sermon. And in that silence she felt both fear and a strange, fragile comfort, as if the answer might not be spoken at all, but carried in the way he had caught her when she fell, in the bread he had shared, in the quiet that was never cruel. The land grew harsher as the days stretched, dry winds sweeping over ridges, where only scrub and stone seemed to live. Elinor rode behind the stranger, wrapped in the same rough blanket he had given her. The silence between them never broke, except for the sound of hooves on dirt or the soft creak of leather. Yet silence did not keep whispers from following. Every camp they passed seemed to know something. Every way station carried rumor as steady as dust. Men lowered their voices when they spoke his name, though none said it to his face. They said the quiet stranger was no ordinary drifter, that he had once worn a badge. Some claimed he had killed more men than he had arrested. Others said he had walked away from the law because he learned the law had no use for truth. Elinor listened without daring to ask him herself, each tale weaving a picture she could not quite see. At one camp a trader glanced at her wrists, still red from shackles, and gave her a look she knew too well, pity mixed with scorn, as if she were just another lost soul bought cheap. But when his gaze shifted to the man beside her, his face changed, respect shading into fear. He poured them water without being asked, hands unsteady. Elinor wanted to ask why. What had the stranger done to hold men in check with nothing more than silence? Yet she swallowed her questions like stones and followed him back to the trail. At a way station by a dry well, two riders spoke low near the fire. She caught the words badge and blood, their eyes flicking toward the stranger as he tied his horse. She shifted closer, pretending not to hear, but their voices carried. One swore he had seen him stand in a courthouse years back. Another swore he had seen him drag a man bleeding through the dust. They said his name then, Jonah Hale, the syllables sharp as iron. Elinor felt her breath catch, not because the name meant anything to her, but because now the mystery had weight. She turned it over in her head all through the night. Jonah Hale, the man who had bought her life, the man who did not speak more than a few words, the man whose silence made others bend their voices to whispers. Some who saw them looked at her with pity, a thin girl clinging to a dangerous man. Some with disgust, whispering that she was no better than cattle traded at a market. Yet none dared step close. None dared say it to his face. It was as if the air around him carried its own warning. Elinor began to notice how people's shoulders stiffened when his eyes passed over them, how their voices faltered when he stood near. And though fear followed him like a shadow, she felt no fear of him herself, only a confusion that grew heavier with each mile. That night, when they camped by a dry wash, she whispered his name for the first time, testing the sound in the dark. Jonah. He did not turn, did not answer, only stirred the fire the same way he always did. Yet she thought she saw his shoulders tighten just slightly, as if even silence could not keep the past from breathing in his ear. The fire burned low that night, the crackle of pine branches sharp against the hush of the wilderness. Elinor sat wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her hands tight around a tin cup half filled with water. her eyes fixed on the glow of the flames, though her thoughts circled like restless horses. The name she had heard at the way station would not leave her mind. Jonah Hale, spoken in tones of both fear and respect. She had turned it over on her tongue in silence all day, and now, as the shadows thickened around them, she felt the weight of it pressing too heavy to keep quiet. She lifted her gaze, watching him as he crouched near the fire, his knife steady as he trimmed strips of dried meat, his movements unhurried as though the night belonged to him alone. The light caught the lines of his face beneath the brim of his hat, and something about the calmness of his silence made her bold. She whispered his name, Jonah, and the sound startled her more than him, for he did not flinch, only looked up with eyes dark and steady, waiting, as though he had known she would ask. Her voice broke when she finally pushed the words, free. Was it true? Had he once been law? Was he now killer? Her breath shook as she said it. Not out of fear, but because the truth mattered more than the stories. She wanted to know if the man who had bought her freedom was shaped by honor or by blood. He did not answer right away. The silence stretched so long she thought he might not speak at all. Then, at last he set the knife down and stirred the fire with a stick, sparks leaping into the night, his voice low when it came, steady as stone. I carried a badge once, and I laid it down, because I saw what men called justice, and it is not always right. The words sank deep, carrying more weight than any confession of guilt or pride. Elinor felt her chest tighten, not from gratitude, but from the way his words echoed truths she had always known, yet never had strength to say aloud. Her wrists itched where scars still burned red from the shackles, and he looked at them with a gaze that seemed to cut through all her defenses. No rope should claim the wrong neck, he said, the sentence falling heavy between them. She gripped her cup tighter, her throat closing with the ache of recognition, for she had been condemned, not for the theft of bread alone, but for being unwanted, for being poor, for daring to survive when others said she had no right. The fire snapped, shadows bending across his face, and she realized he was not giving her comfort, not pity either, but truth spoken plain. She turned her face toward the dark hills, her eyes wet though no tears fell. The air was sharp in her lungs. She wanted to thank him, yet the word stuck. What rose instead was a fragile steadiness, the sense that she was no longer alone in carrying the weight of lies called justice. The night seemed to stretch wider, the silence between them no longer hollow but shared, and for the first time, since the rope had been promised at dawn, she felt something stir in her chest that was not fear, but the faint shape of worth. The canyon walls rose high and close on either side, red stone catching the light of the late sun. The trail narrowed, so that the sound of their horse echoed as though another rider followed. Elinor kept her eyes on the ground, her body tired from days without true rest. When the sharp cry of a child reached her ears, she looked up quick. A wagon stood broken near the bend. One wheel collapsed, the horse lying stiff in the dust, its ribs showing where it had starved before the end. Beside it, a woman clutched a boy, no older than 4, her face drawn and pale, her dress torn from hard travel, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that expected danger more than help. Jonah slowed their horse and dismounted, his movements calm, his hat shadowing his face. He did not speak right away, only crouched beside the shattered wheel and ran his hand along the cracked spokes. Elinor slid down awkwardly, her legs weak. The boy reached for her with desperate small hands. She took him without thinking, his tiny body pressed against hers, his sobs shaking through his chest. She rocked him gently, her arms remembering motions she had never truly known, her voice low as she whispered nothing words, only soft sounds to ease his crying. The woman's gaze fixed on her sharp, suspicion filling her expression. Her mouth trembled as she whispered that she had seen Elinor's face before, her voice a hiss cutting through the canyon air. A wanted poster. Thief, rope. Elinor's stomach dropped. The boy stirred, uneasy at the sound. She clutched him tighter, shame rising fast. the familiar sting of being marked not by who she was, but by what others said. Her eyes dropped to the dust, her body folding inward, as though the accusation was a hand pressing her down. Jonah did not lift his head from the wheel, but his voice cut firm. Steady. She's with me. 3 words spoken plain yet heavier than iron. The woman froze, her suspicion flickering into unease. Jonah's tone carried no room for argument. His eyes, when he looked up, were like stone, daring her to speak again. The woman swallowed and said nothing, shifting her gaze back to the broken wagon, as if the words had sealed something she could not undo. Elinor blinked quick, her chest tight, the boy's small hand clutching at her sleeve, and for the first time since she had been freed, she felt not like a burden carried, but like someone defended. Jonah worked with quiet focus, prying loose a fallen branch, wedging it under the axle, binding the wheel with rawhide from his pack. Sweat darkened his shirt, though he never hurried. When the wagon stood steady enough to roll, he rose, his hands streaked with dust. The woman murmured a stiff thank you without meeting his eyes. Elinor passed the child back gently, the boy clinging a moment longer before letting go. The woman still watched her with doubt, but said nothing more. Jonah mounted, offering Elinor a hand to follow. She took it, the weight of his pull firm, steady, a wordless promise. And as they rode from the canyon, she held the memory of his voice in her chest. She's with me, more powerful than any rope, more binding than any law. The night settled deep around them. The stars spread wide above the hills like scattered embers. The fire Jonah built burned low, its light painting the hollow of the canyon in shifting orange. Elinor sat close enough to feel its warmth, yet not close enough to ease the chill that lived inside her bones. The blanket still wrapped tight around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the flames, though her mind was far from them. She thought of the woman in the canyon, of the boy who had clung to her sleeve, of the suspicion in the woman's gaze, and shame stirred again, sharp and heavy, pressing at her, until she felt it rising in her throat like smoke. She had carried silence long enough, and tonight it felt too heavy to keep. She drew a breath, her voice breaking as she said she was not a thief by nature, her words halting as though her tongue fought against each one. She told him she had been cast off, not wanted, punished not for any crime, but for surviving when others had wished she hadn't. Her mother dead before she was grown, her father gone like dust on the wind, leaving her with nothing but scraps to cling to. She learned to live with less, to eat crusts and drink ditch water, to keep her head down in streets where pity never reached. Her hands twisted in the blanket as she confessed how the chains on her wrists were not from hunger alone, but from the eyes of people who saw her as less than nothing, who had waited for her to fail so they could call her curse fulfilled. Her chest shook as she whispered the truth of the night she was taken. She had not stolen for herself. She had seen a boy coughing in an alley, ribs sharp as bones on a carcass, his skin pale, his breath ragged. She had gone to the storehouse not for greed, but for bread and a pouch of medicine. Her voice cracked as she said it. Her shame and pride tangled until she could not tell one from the other. She had been caught with the loaf half hidden beneath her shawl, dragged into the street, while the boy lived one more night, perhaps more, though she would never know. She turned her eyes away, tears burning though they would not fall, her words trembling into silence at last. Her body slumped, as if she had laid down a burden too heavy to carry. Jonah had not interrupted, not once. He had sat steady across the fire, his knife idle in his hands, his gaze fixed on her though not piercing, his jaw tight as if her words pressed against him too. When her voice broke into quiet, he let the silence stretch, the flames snapping between them, his face unreadable. Then at last his voice came low and certain. "Then you stole, right?" The words struck her harder than any sermon. Her throat closed, her chest aching, not with shame this time, but with the strange relief of being seen without scorn. The fire cracked again, and she pulled the blanket closer, holding his words against her heart, like the first true kindness she had ever been given. The night passed uneasy. the wind restless in the trees. And when the first gray light touched the horizon, Jonah was already awake. Saddling the horse with the same calm he carried in all things, Elinor moved stiffly, her body sore from too many nights on the hard ground, yet her heart carried a heavier weight, for she had seen the sheriff's eyes when Jonah laid the silver on his desk. Greed cut with spite. She knew men like that did not forgive being crossed. And though Jonah spoke no warning, she felt it in the stillness of his shoulders, in the way his gaze swept the hills as they set out. The danger waiting was not a question but a certainty. By mid-morning the sun burned gold against the ridges, and the sound of hooves reached them before the riders appeared. Elinor looked up to see shapes crest the rise, rifles catching the light like sharp teeth. The sheriff rode at their head, his coat whipping in the wind, his jaw set hard, his eyes locked on Jonah, as though he had found the quarry of a hunt. Jonah slowed the horse, his hand brushing the grip of his revolver, his voice steady as he told her to stay behind. But Elinor stepped forward before she could think, her boots sinking into the dust as she raised her chin and shouted that she would not be taken again. Her voice cracked but carried clear across the canyon air. The riders reined in, laughter breaking out sharp and cruel. The sheriff barked that she was nothing but a thief, a girl cursed from the day she was born, worth less than the rope they had spared her. The men echoed him with jeers, their faces twisted in mockery. But behind her, Jonah had dismounted, his frame tall and still, the revolver heavy at his side. He said nothing, only stood like an unmoved wall, and the laughter began to falter. Unease flickering in their eyes, Elinor felt it ripple through them. The way silence could be more dangerous than rage, the way Jonah's calm presence turned their cruelty into something brittle. The sheriff sneered, spitting into the dirt, and raised his rifle, his voice cutting sharp as he shouted that the law did not bend for silver or for whores. His finger tightened on the trigger, and in the same breath, Jonah's revolver cleared leather, the crack of the shot shattering the morning. The sheriff's hat flew from his head as the bullet carved the air just past his ear. The men jolted, rifles lifting, dust rising as horses reared. The silence broken into chaos. Shots rang out wild and sharp. Splinters flew from the rocks, and Jonah's hand moved with deadly precision, each pull of the trigger measured, each step deliberate as he pressed them back. Elinor ran for the horse, heart pounding, bullets whining past. Jonah caught her arm, swung her up into the saddle, and climbed behind. In one fluid motion, the horse surged forward down the canyon trail, the posse's shouts echoing, their gunfire chasing, the dust rising thick behind. The chase had begun, and Elinor clutched the reins tight, her body pressed against Jonah's as the world narrowed to the pounding of hooves, the sting of wind, and the unshakable vow inside her chest that she would not fall back into the hands of men who had already tried to kill her once. The river bent wide and fast before them, its waters churning against the rocks, and the canyon walls rose steep on either side, so there was no way forward and no way back. Jonah reined the horse to a halt, his breath calm, though Elinor could feel the tension in his frame. The sound of hooves thundered behind them as the posse poured into view, rifles glinting in the late sun. The sheriff at their head, with his jaw set tight and his eyes locked sharp. Dust rolled with the riders, curling around them like smoke, and Elinor felt her chest tighten, as if the rope itself had already slipped over her neck. Yet she did not turn to run. There was nowhere left to flee. The sheriff pulled his horse up just a few yards away, his sneer spreading slow across his face. He spat into the dirt and called her what she had always been called: thief, liar, curse. He barked that a woman like her deserved the rope, that the world had no use for her except to hang as a warning. Then his gaze shifted to Jonah, his voice sharp as steel as he jeered that a man should know better than to throw silver away on trash. The posse laughed at his words, though unease still flickered behind their eyes. Their rifles raised but their hands not steady, as if the silence of the man standing calm by the river unsettled them more than bullets. Jonah's revolver hung at his side, his stance steady, and for a moment it seemed he would raise it, and let lead answer. But Elinor felt something rise in her chest that pushed past fear, her body shaking but her legs carrying her forward. She stepped between Jonah and the rifles, her heart hammering as she lifted her chin. Her voice broke but still carried across the water. She shouted that her life was her own, not theirs to sell, not theirs to end. Her words tore raw from her throat, louder than she had ever spoken in her life. The sheriff leaned back, startled for a breath, before his sneer returned. But the laughter of the men behind him faltered, their eyes shifting to one another as if the ground beneath them had tilted. Jonah's voice followed hers, louder than it had ever been since she had known him, his words low but sharp enough to cut through the jeers. Her debt was paid, he said. She belongs to no man. The stillness of his tone carried more force than any shout. The sheriff's sneer twitched, his hand tightening on the reins, and a murmur moved through the posse like wind through grass. One rider muttered under his breath that she had a right. Another spat, but lowered his rifle. The strength of the crowd began to crack. The sheriff barked again, calling them fools, but the edge in his voice was frayed now. He pulled at his reins as if to charge, but none followed. The current of the river roared louder in the silence that fell. Elinor's body trembled, though she did not lower her head. Jonah stepped forward beside her, his presence steady as stone, his shadow falling long across the sand. The sheriff cursed, spat once more, and jerked his horse around, the others shifting uneasy, before trailing after, their dust rising into the reddening sky. Elinor stood there by the river, her breath ragged, Jonah's words echoing in her chest like a shield she had never known she could carry. For the first time she believed she was not something to be owned, not rope, not silver, not shame, but her own. The river roared behind them as the posse's dust faded into the distance, the echoes of hooves slowly swallowed by the canyon walls. Elinor stood with her breath sharp in her chest, her body trembling, but her head still high. Jonah's steady presence at her side, the only anchor in a world that had tried to drag her down again and again. The sheriff's words still lingered in the air, but they had broken against the calm strength of Jonah's voice, and against the fire in hers. Shame had turned the riders away, their rifles useless against truth spoken plain, and at last silence filled the river's bend, heavy and pure. She turned to Jonah, his gaze unreadable but steady, and together without another word they waded across the current, the cold biting at their legs yet never slowing them, ragged but unbroken, each step forward a choice no man could take back. The hills beyond the river welcomed them with quiet, days turning into weeks, as the rhythm of survival shaped itself into something steadier. Jonah found a hollow of land tucked against the trees, where water ran clear, and the soil could be worked. There they built a cabin, rough timber, raised by his strong hands, her smaller ones learning with each nail and beam, splinters biting but never stopping her. The roof held against the rain, the walls kept the wind at bay, and soon it was more than shelter, it was theirs. Carved from the wild by will alone, she planted seeds in the soil, fingers black with earth, and watched shoots rise tender and green. She mended his shirts by firelight, her stitches crooked at first, then steady with practice. She learned to ride without clutching in fear, her body finding balance in the saddle as the horse carried her across open fields. And with each day the chains that once marked her wrists seemed to fade, the scars still there but no longer raw. Jonah spoke little as always, his silence no longer heavy, but deep, with a kind of peace she had never known. He showed her how to listen to the world, how to read the bend of grass in the wind, how to know when rain was coming by the scent of the air. His voice, when he used it, was slow and measured, words chosen like stones, placed to build something that would last. She found comfort in that, in knowing he spoke, not to fill the air, but to give it weight. She learned that silence was not punishment, not shame, but rest, a place where she could breathe without fear of being mocked or struck down. One evening, as the fire burned low, she sat close, her hands folded in her lap, the glow painting his face in gold and shadow. She felt the word rise in her throat, fragile as glass. She whispered it soft, home. The sound trembled as though afraid to be heard, yet once spoken, it filled the cabin with warmth. Jonah lifted his eyes to hers, the faintest curve at his mouth, and he whispered it back, home. The quiet stranger, who had once paid for her freedom, now giving her something greater. Not coin, not protection, but a place in the world that no rope could steal. A home without chains, and for the first time she believed it was truly hers. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.